Hi, my name is Morris Franco. This is the 5th video in my series on the national debt, and up to this point, the most difficult one to do. In my first video, I made a couple of bold statements. One, that by 2020, in less than 5 years, annual interest on the national debt will have passed the $1 trillion mark. And two, it will require at least 20% of all revenues to fund the national debt. Now let me repeat this. That's $1 trillion or 1,000 billion for those who don't know what the number 1 trillion means. You will be amazed at the number of people who will debate this issue without having a clue to what a trillion means. In this video, I will attempt to show you how I arrived at this conclusion. It will require a lot of talking by me and a lot of patience by you, the viewer. I sincerely believe that after seeing this video, you will come to the same conclusion. This issue takes up a complete chapter in my book, The National Debt Crisis, America's Armageddon. Now I want to emphasize that the point I'm trying to bring home in this video is that the very foundation of the American democracy and the American system is at stake, and the national debt will play out, if it plays out as I'm forecasting in this scenario, and I back it up with some pretty strong facts. If it plays out, it will threaten our very way of life. So please stay with me on this, as it requires a lot of attention on your part, and it's very difficult to explain, but I'll take a shot. I call it the countdown to the detonation of the national debt bomb. Self-destruction, the facts that prove the theory. Communism failed to diminish the greatness of the United States. Our freedoms and capital systems stand tall for the entire world to envy. Religious fanatics are now trying to do what communism couldn't. They have no chance of success. There are many countries who would relish the idea of a diminished United States. However, all they have to do is wait. We are doing and will continue to do more damage to ourselves with the national debt crisis than most people could possibly imagine. The national debt is a growing bubble that, in my opinion, will burst within a decade after the Federal Reserve returns to normal rates. Remember when the housing bubble burst in 2008 and all the damage it did to the U.S. economy? We'll see that as a minor bump in the road when compared to the economic Armageddon that will result from the coming national debt crisis. The following countdown to the national debt explosion explains how we got where we are and where we're headed. I start out in the year 1989, and in 1989 we had a national debt of $2.8 trillion, a deficit of $161 billion, and we paid $165 billion in debt interest. In the early 1980s, the national debt problem began to unfold. President Ronald Reagan successfully pushed for both a massive buildup in the military complex and a massive reduction in individual taxes. The national debt as a percentage of GDP jumped from about 35% to about 55% during this period. Reagan was not the first president to use deficit spending as a means to meet budget needs, but to the best of my knowledge, he was the first who believed it was an acceptable way of meeting a political agenda, and he made it easy for future presidents to follow suit. Things went downhill a little further during the George H. Bush presidency. The debt to GDP ratio jumped an additional 10% to 65%. One of the major reasons for this was the cost of the war with Iraq. However, the downward trend reversed a little bit during the Clinton presidency. The dot-com technology boom caused a 10% improvement, pushing the debt to GDP ratio down to 55%. Now I jump to 2008. All right, 2008, we got a national debt of 10 trillion, a budget deficit of 408 billion, and we're paying 244 billion in interest. During the George W. Bush presidency, the national debt problem took a major turn for the worse. The Gulf War in Afghanistan and the Second Iraqi War caused large increases in deficit spending. In those 8 years, the budget deficit exceeded 425 billion only once, and that was in his last year in office, 2009, when it skyrocketed to 1.4 trillion, more than triple the previous year. That was the first time it breached the $1 trillion mark. The 700 billion TARP program to bail out the banks made up the lion's share of that budget deficit. Almost all the TARP loans made to banks were paid back to the U.S. Treasury. Since this 700 billion was part of the 2009 budget deficit, the return fund should have been used to pay down the debt. I was unable to find out what actually happened with those return funds. By the end of the George W. Bush presidency, the debt to GDP ratio had reached 80%. The national debt problem was getting serious, yet there was still no concern and no pain. Politicians gave the subject a little lip service and little else. Now we jump to the year 2012. 2012, we got a national debt of 16 trillion, a budget deficit of 1.3 trillion, and we're paying only 225 billion in interest. I say only 225 billion. You'll understand why later. President Obama adopted the $1 trillion budget deficit threshold reached in 2009 as the standard and accumulated more than 5 trillion in budget deficits during his first term alone. This pushed the debt to GDP ratio to about 103%. The deficit spending problem reached a new level. The national debt problem is now a crisis, but that's not what President Obama wants to talk about. The President and his supporters continue to lowball the problem, keeping it out of the public eye. As a result, the public continues to believe that this high level of deficit spending and a $16 trillion national debt is not a serious problem. The raging stock market, a totally distorted employment picture, and a misrepresentation of the economic growth picture support the President's position. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, estimates an average budget deficit of 630 billion a year for the next 10 years. Based on past forecasts, this number is probably on the low side. The CBO has a long history of underestimating budget requirements. Its assumptions are subject to unforeseen economic events such as the 2008 severe recession. Sometime in the next few years, the economy and unemployment will improve enough to meet the Fed's targets for returning to normal interest rates. The Federal Reserve set these economic targets as data points that, when reached, would show that the economy was normalizing. It is expected that the Fed will gradually reduce and even totally end its massive bond buying program used to keep rates down, followed by a gradual increase in interest rates back to normal levels. This means the Fed will push rates up to 5% or 6% from the current 2%. Under normal conditions, the Fed would raise rates by 1/4% each quarter or 1% a year. If this is correct, it will take 3 years to get to 5%, to a 5% rate, and 4 years to get to a 6% rate. The political establishment and the media argue that the return to normal economic conditions will result in added revenues and reduced deficit spending. This is true, but returning to normal rates will cause more problems than it solves. It's not possible to forecast how the pain of the national debt problem will play out as interest rates rise to normal levels. But it is clear that even though there is no pain now, there will be serious pain when normal rates return. The financial impact on a nation's budget from the from the Fed's decision to return to normal rates is easily calculated. The impact on the nation's economy as in the citizens is not. Determining the former is just a matter of estimating the start date and working out the numbers. I'm going on the assumption that the Fed will start raising rates at the beginning of 2015, and rates will raise at a rate of 1% per year, going from 2% to 6% over a 4-year period. I am assuming no major events will alter government spending positions. I am also assuming a deficit spending will continue at a rate of $750 billion a year, and here I have to add something. My projected annual budget deficit of $750 billion appears to be a little over, appears to be an overestimate, being that in 2014, the 2014 fiscal year ended with a deficit of only $483 billion. In my opinion, this is just a one-year aberration. I could list many reasons for my forecast, but there are two sides to the issue. Personally, I attribute it mostly to the increase in capital gains revenues resulting from a booming stock market, which I believe was a direct result of the super low interest rates, which forced investors out of bonds into stocks. In any case, it's really irrelevant, since I estimated the national debt at $17.75 trillion instead of the $18 trillion it actually was, and was inclusive of the $483 billion budget deficit instead of the $750 billion I had forecasted. I admit this is pure speculation on my part. However, I still stand by my estimates going forward. In fact, I think over the long run, my estimates may be a little low. The crux of my book on the national debt is that the reason the debt will grow is the debt itself. As I said, I'm assuming no major events will alter government spending projections. I'm assuming deficit spending will continue at a rate of $750 billion a year. If these assumptions are in the ballpark, debt interest will jump from $355 billion in 2014 to $903 billion by 2018. Even without further rate increases in the following 3 years through 2021, debt interest will jump an additional $309 billion to a total of $1.2 trillion. This is because existing previously issued debt will be issued at the higher interest rate. And here I got to do a little explaining. This is a chart of the national debt, but what I want to highlight is the color scheme. You see red, blue, so on and so on. That's the makeup of the debt. And the debt is made up of various treasury securities of various maturities. Treasury bills which mature in less than a year, 3-year, 5-year, 7-year, 10-year, and 30-year securities. So when you got let's say you got a $10 trillion debt, and let's say the debt was at 2% for the last 30 years, and every single bond issued by the government yields at 2%. And the Fed comes along and raises the rate to 3%. What's going to happen is, at the end of 1 year, 100% of the treasury bills will go from 2% to 3%. 1/3 of the 3-year treasuries will go from 2% to 3%, 1/5 of the 5-year, 1/10 of the 10-year, and so on. So in fact, when a Fed raises rates, only 40% of the total debt is affected in the first year, 55% in the second year, almost 70% in the third year, and so on. And here's an exact breakdown if you want to look at the figures. First year 41, 55, 69, 5th year 81, 10th year 92. Okay, never mind the rest of the figures, they're not relevant to this discussion. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make, and it's very difficult to explain, is that, as I said, in the first year 40% of the debt is affected by the rates. But if the Fed raises rates 2, 3, 4 years in a row, in effect, in year 1, 40% is affected. In year 2, 41% of the debt is affected by that rate for that 1 year. 55% or 15%, I'm sorry, is affected for 2 years, because 40% already has the new rate, and now 2 years into it, 55% of the original rate is affected into the debt. So year one, you got 40%. Year two, you got 15% that has the total new rate. And then it's year three, it becomes 40 and so on. It's difficult to explain, but it's a graduated level. And when after 10, let's say when the rate reaches 5% or 6% steadily for 5 years in a row, each year will roughly be the same, except that those securities that are still out there, if you're doing it for 5 years, those 7-year, 10-year, 30-year securities that have yet to mature, even though you're not raising rates, the debt interest will go up because those securities that are already out there at the lower rates will be reissued at the current rate, and that will cause a bump in the interest. Okay. Now that I confused everybody, including myself, I'll go back to the book. All right, 2014. 2014, the debt will increase by only $15 billion. Interest remains at 2%, nothing to get excited about. The only effect on a budget deficit is the additional interest from the previous year deficit. In other words, nothing changed, it's just that the deficit went up because of excess spending. Now we're into 2015. And things start to get a little confusing. Okay, here's 2015. Now here we have an estimated national debt of 18 trillion. 40% of the debt, or 7.4 trillion of that 18 trillion, is paying 3% interest. The remaining 60% is still paying 2% interest, because like I said, 40% of the debt is affected in year one. Okay. 2015. The pain associated with the Federal Reserve program to return to annual rates starts in 2015 when the interest rates adjust by 89 billion to 25%, or 25%. Now what you see here is that 1% increase on a debt of $18 trillion caused the debt to go up by 89 billion in just 1 year, and 1% at only 40% of the debt. Let me repeat that. 40% of the debt of the $18 trillion or $19 trillion debt is increasing by only 1%, and that 1% equates to $89 billion. Staggering when you think about it. The 1% rise in rates put into effect in 2015 means 40% of national debt will have a 3% interest rate, 60% will carry the 2% rate. $18 billion of that $89 billion increase is due to the $750 billion budget deficit. In other words, had the debt remained the same, the deficit would have been $89 billion less. But that's not the case. Okay, from going forward, I will not break out that yearly bump in the deficit. I will just include it as part of the total figures. Okay, now we're into 2016. And this is the last one I'm going to show you by year. Just have to take my word on the rest. Here we have a deficit of 19 trillion. 7.7 trillion is paying 4%, which is still 40%. But that's paying 4%, not the 3%. 15% has the 3% and 4%, and 3% and 4% built into it, and the remaining has the is still at 2%. So it kind of gets confusing. And there's the dollar amounts if you want to equate it as for the total of I can't make it out. It's $568 billion in debt interest. Okay, that was 2016. Debt interest will jump another 28% from the previous year, increasing 124 billion. Now you have to remember. Now you got 55% of the debt is at 3%, and 40% is at 4%. Those two numbers alone push the debt interest by $124 billion. Okay, 2017. When I'm not going to show you anymore. It's just more of the same. We're now into the third consecutive year of a 1% rate increase. Debt increase jumped another 28% from the previous year Now 40% of the debt is yielding a 5% rate, and so on. The jump of $162 billion brings the annual debt interest to $730 billion. Remember, just 3 years earlier, 2014, the annual debt interest was $355 billion. Now here you got to remember, going back to the scenario, we're in the third year. So now 40% of that is at 5%. 15% is at 4%. X amount, I don't know the number off the top of my head, is at 3%, and the remainder at 2%. So those numbers alone push the debt $162 billion more than the previous year. And I want to tell you, these are all realistic. An interest rate of 5 to 6%, like I mentioned or showed before in the chart, is nothing to write home about. It's like average or even a little below average. In 2018, the last year, the 1% rate hikes, or the rates of 6%, causes the debt increase to jump by additional $173 billion, or 24%, to $903 billion. That's 2018. 2019, if my assumptions are correct, 2019 will be the year the annual debt interest will exceed the $1 trillion threshold at $1,021 billion. The annual debt interest will be $119 billion more than the previous year, a 13% increase. The annual debt interest will grow by 13%, even though the interest held steady 6% for 2 consecutive years. The portion of national debt subject to 6% will go from 40% to 55%, and so on. As I mentioned, a larger and larger portion of the debt maintains a new rate. In 2020, the last year in this scenario, the annual debt interest amount will increase another $112 billion, or 9%, to $1.133 trillion. This will be the third consecutive year of the 6% rate, which will now consume 70% of the national debt. For the record, if the Fed maxed out rate increases at 5% instead of 6%, the amount of debt interest over the entire period would have been $156 billion less, or $977 billion, just short of $1 trillion in 2020. That's if they stop at 5%. $977 billion by 2020. Tremont. As I previously stated, determining the size of the national debt and the annual interest payments in 2020 is a relatively easy process. Determining the effect of the national debt problem on the American way of life is a completely different matter. In this scenario, the effect of the Fed's raising rates was an additional $2.7 trillion in interest expense, meaning taxpayers would have to fork over $5.5 trillion over the 7-year period to fund the national debt. To repeat, what I'm saying here is, had the Fed left rates alone, the interest paid over that period would have been $2.7 trillion less than if they went from 2% to 6%. And in fact, they will pay in those 7 years $5.5 trillion just to pay debt interest. That's like 1.5 years of all the income the United States gets from government and corporate taxes. The country is already running a $650 billion budget deficit and annual debt interest payments of $340 billion. The interest rate hikes will increase debt by $114 billion in 2015 and $793 billion by 2020, bringing it to a total of $1.13 trillion annually. These increases will have to be offset by budget cuts and tax increases, or dumped onto the national debt. If you think the government will take the first option, I have a bridge to sell you. The alternative the government will probably adopt is to add the lion's share of the debt interest onto the national debt. So instead of a $22 trillion national debt in 2020, we'll be looking at a $24 trillion debt. Instead of annual debt interest of $1.3 trillion, we'll have national debt interest of $1.2 trillion, $1.22, and that assumes a stable interest rate environment. The wake-up call will come in the years 2015 2015 through 2018, as debt interest will more than double, jumping from $444 billion to $903 billion. The question is, will politicians come to their senses and do what is necessary to put our economy on a sound footing, or will they continue to act irresponsibly and spend to push a political agenda? The first option will require major austerity measures and inflict major pain in almost every area of the economy. The alternative will bring a countdown to zero and bring on an economic Armageddon, similar to what happened in Greece. When will our leadership deal with this crisis? The Obama administration argues that the debt is manageable. In my opinion, our political leadership couldn't care less about the national debt. To them, it's just a number conservative use to highlight excessive government spending on liberal programs. It's a thorn in their side. They just want to go away. Politicians give little attention, give the debt attention only because the government is required to budget the interest that funds it. It will be the Federal Reserve's decision to raise interest rates that will expose the problem and ultimately force the government to act. Unfortunately, this action will eventually cause a financial meltdown. If the government doesn't act preemptively, bondholders worldwide will deem the creditworthiness of the United States unacceptable and dump their securities on the open market. This action has the potential of causing a major spike in interest rates and will cause additional selling of bonds and stocks, pushing interest rates to even higher levels. This also has the potential of causing as much as a 30% to 50% drop in the stock market, or roughly 5,000 to 7,000 Dow points. Once bond traders sell their securities en masse, the Federal Reserve will be out of the picture because free markets will overwhelm any potential Fed action. Should the Fed decide it can force rates down by buying a few trillion worth of Treasury bonds, traders worldwide will view this action as a panic move and accelerate the liquidation of their bond holdings. The President and Congress have only two options in dealing with this problem: raising taxes and cutting spending. I'm not talking about normal budget differences between Republicans and Democrats. I'm talking about draconian cuts and major tax increases. If my assumptions about the depth of the forthcoming crisis are anywhere near the mark, interest rates will be pushing 7 to 10%, and debt interest will exceed $1.5 trillion annually and increase at an accelerating rate. On the spending side, budget cutters will target government employee pensions, currently the largest expense in the budget, as well as defense, education, and welfare. Also on the table will be entitlement benefits, an issue politicians have been avoiding dealing with for decades. On the revenue side, there will be tax increases across the board with both individual and corporations. You can count on our resourceful political leadership to come up with a few original ideas for raising taxes. The major credit agencies' downgrades of American debt will be sure to follow and only add fuel to the fire. The residual effects of the financial crisis will reach far and wide. The country is likely to go into a severe recession. Unemployment will skyrocket. Consumer confidence will tank. The government will be looking to cut expenses and raise taxes when the country's economy is in the toilet. This crisis will cause social unrest and possible street riots. Unions will be striking or threatening to do so to demand their pension benefits back and the end of possible salary freeze. Welfare recipients will be demonstrating for a restoration of benefits that have been cut off. The unemployed will be demonstrating for more embedded jobs. The tanking of the American economy will severely affect our European and Asian trading partners, as well as every other country that has a capitalist form of government. There will be winners, and they will include communist governments, dictatorships, and all the countries that envy the success of our capitalist form of government. The political establishment will take the position that we can grow our way out of this problem. This theory is a practical solution, but in reality, it's politically impossible. The only way to stop the growth of the national debt is to balance the budget. Our political leadership was unable to balance the current budget with an interest rate of 2%, near record lows, and debt interest of only $340 billion. How in the world are they going to balance a budget when interest rates are at 5% or 6% and annual debt interest of nearly $1 trillion expected by 2020? Support for a balanced budget with Democrats controlling any one of the three branches of government is nil. This scenario is pure speculation on my part. It's all but certain that the national debt problem will not play out as described here. Predicting the events leading up to the crisis is next to impossible. Nevertheless, it is safe to assume that major problems lie ahead for our leadership if our leadership doesn't act. The consequences of not forcibly dealing with it could be catastrophic. In my opinion, the Obama administration bears the primary guilt for the problem. The national debt will just about double by the end of the Obama second term. Debt interest over the entire 8 years of his presidency will exceed $8 trillion. President Obama is also responsible for the party line vote mentality that now corrupts both political parties. The vote that passed Obamacare was 60 out of 60 Democrats in favor and 40 out of 40 Republicans against. Here we have 100 well-educated, allegedly smart people voting on the merits of the most important bill in many a decade. But without exception, no senator broke party lines, proving that party loyalty and not the merits of the health care bill was the driving force behind its passage. I make this point to illustrate that presidential leadership on this issue, while absolutely necessary, will not be forthcoming anytime soon. It is my opinion that our government will go on its merry ways if the national debt were a fantasy. If that is what our leadership does and dumps all the new debt interest from the federal interest rate increase onto the national debt, then, and I end right there. You use your own judgment. Anyway, that's my piece on why I think we got serious problems. I hope you found it informative. Thank you.